Hi, everyone. This is Tori Vandelin with Prevent Connect. This podcast is part 2 of a 3-part series where Susan Gomberpour interviews Amy Thompson to discuss close to home as a community-driven approach to violence prevention.
A lot about process, which I think is so important for this particular approach.
Yeah.
And also let's talk about so what did it look like? What happened? Where'd it go?
Yeah. Well, so as we talked about, we did a lot of piloting and a lot of testing, and then over time, like I would say over, once we had the resources to really dig in, I think I would say it took 4 or 5 years for us to be able to say, okay, this is what we think we're doing in terms of steps or phases of work.
So what were the projects that people chose to do, and where did that go?
Yeah, definitely. Sure. So in terms of the coalescing into an approach, what we found was that that was a process, an organizing or mobilization process that iterates, and that really starts with really deeply getting to know our community. Even though many of us had lived in this community for years, right? Some for decades, that it's really helpful before we move into action to stop and really take a look around and say, okay, who's here now and what is going on in this space that we are in? Close to home is very sort of place-based, sort of physical place-based, as part of its lens. And what else do we need to learn if we're going to really engage ourselves in developing solutions to domestic and sexual violence? And so that includes, which we've already talked a little bit about, mapping, like getting out there, doing physical maps, like really understanding the geographic context and strengths of where we're trying to engage in the work. It included really understanding who the key actors in the neighborhood are. And that includes both formal leaders, electeds, organizational leaders, but also informal leaders that might even have more influence, right, than some of the folks with these titled roles. So the grandmother on the corner that knows everything that's going on, right? That key youth leader that's a major influencer in their social network, really getting to know who those folks are, building relationships with them. A lot of this comes through, connections. And we did a lot of one-on-ones, like the kind of classic organizing method of having coffee or ice cream or whatever you want to snack on, and just really talking. What is it that you love about this community? Why do you do what you do? What motivates you? And here's what motivates me. And how do those things connect? And how can we build power together? That's a big part of it. We then really moved into, if that was a lot of one-on-one work and a lot of observation, then the next phase of the approach is called talk. And this is, how do we engage in more public dialogue? How do we lift up the conversation about these issues in the civic life? So that's being out at community meetings. We did a lot of gatherings, which we called kitchen table conversations, right, where we would literally, again, have a lot of food and invite people together. And we would just talk about what people think. What do you think of when you hear the words domestic and sexual violence? What's important to you? What would you do? We did scenarios. We developed arts projects that lifted the conversation up in the community. And the goal of that particular phase of the work is to engage in, like I said, in more public conversation, but then also to recruit people, right? To see, okay, who else is excited, and ideate solutions. And so, okay, what are some of the other ideas that you all have? Mm-hmm. So in some of our early work in Dorchester and Boston, folks, we learned through the assessment phase and through the talk phase that folks really felt like they didn't know what to do and what to say when domestic and sexual violence came up.
Right.
They felt it was vital, that community members felt it was vital that the work that we did was intergenerational, that there were youth and adults involved in it, and that we needed to do some local norms change campaign work that the community itself developed. Because at the time there was a lot of the wonderful national and international, intermediaries and even state organizations develop awareness campaigns and different kinds of campaigns. And people said, we want our own. We want it to reflect our local culture, our local people and places, and we want to decide what the messages are. And so, yeah, so then from that, that's just one example, right, of what came out of, and then after that, within the third of the 4 phases, so that was the action, phase 4. We're going to do a big locally developed norms change campaign that invites people to take action on these issues. And so then phase 3, the build phase, is the community coming together in different teams to actually create this campaign, right? We had a group of folks that designed the posters, that designed the strategy, that, developed different elements of the campaign. Simultaneously, there were a group of young people that were developing a literary magazine about their experiences with intersectional violence, and that was used at after-school programs to elevate the conversation. So, that's the power of a network, right?
I'm sorry, you said that was used in the what program?
Oh, in after-school programs and in different settings where the youth brought it to actually have conversations and poetry slams, again, to lift up public conversation. While at the same time we were planning this campaign and having block parties, and we had a knitting group, we actually had a ballroom dancing club. So, all of these different activities building off the strengths of folks in the network to bring people together, to build community, and to have conversations about these issues, driven towards action in a fun way, right? In a fun, connected way. And so that's just sort of a very fast, sort of example of how we moved through one set of phases. The set of phases one time, that was a number of years in where we had a number of staff. The network had a lot of people in it. And so we had the ability to be running all of these different, clusters of activity at the same time.
So that's really interesting. So in those ways where they're showing up in ballroom dancing and knitting and poetry slams and zines and all of that, is that the part where they are inviting people into conversation and seeing what they can build, or is that the actual action part, we're using these settings to have these conversations and raise awareness and try to shift the conversation around violence and how that shows up in our community?
Yeah, well, I think that it's both. I think that, that there's a lot of, we joke about this actually in some of the projects in California. It's how do you tell the difference between when we're engaging in talk and lifting up the conversation and then actually engaging in the action? Because I do think that if we're having conversations that are about critical thinking and connecting to our stories, that is norms change work, right? So I do think that is part of the norms change work. And then, in some of the campaign work we did, we also said, okay, we're going to launch this campaign. We called it the 1000 Actions campaign. And we asked people, okay, what are the action, report in on the actions that you're going to take. And we far exceeded, I can't remember the number now, but it was, I feel over 3,000 actions were reported, during this time. And so, yeah, I think that there's a both and there with that.
Right. Wow. No, I think there's kind of a fractal way that this happens, right? Where you're starting to have conversations with each other in a smaller group. And that is in a way pushing out even how you all think about and your own awareness about violence and how it manifests in different ways in the community, ways that you may not have touched you personally, but then you're hearing somebody else's story.
Right.
So that does totally make sense to me. So let's talk a little bit about maybe evaluation or assessment or feedback, how you all thought about is this working? Is it where we hoped? What are we moving the dial on? Are things happening that we didn't even think might happen, right?
Right.
I mean, more about that phase.
Yeah. Well, so we had limited resources for evaluation. And so most of the evaluation that we did in Boston, that things are a little bit different as the work grew, but that was through qualitative sources, right?
I appreciate that
yeah.
as a researcher. So I'm like, yeah,
Yeah.
of course it was. Go ahead.
Yeah. So people shared with us in different ways how engagement with the network shifted their values. I mean, people talked about it in that, like, that's actually a quote. This shifted my values. A young person shared that when we interviewed him about his, like, what this has meant to him. We had a professor from a local university that did actually some qualitative interviews with some of the young people, and they spoke about value shift. They spoke about how it changed that and how that translated into behavior changes, and also sort of shifting their own sense of who they could be as their full self in the work.
Uh-huh. Well, what did that mean, like their full self showing up in the work? Tell me, unpack that a little bit.
Oh, I think, that we in this work talk about the man box and the confines of that. And I think that that they were speaking to being able to sort of be outside of the confines of that with each other within the context of the network, right? And then that also supported them to try that even in other parts of their lives too. As one example.
Well, it's funny because this is just the previous conversation I had as part of this series was with Michael Jackson from Peace Pros.
Uh-huh.
Their whole thing, I don't know if you're familiar with them. Okay, well, their whole thing is exactly that, unpacking, like, just masculinity, right? Like, and what's in that box, what's outside the box that, it feels sometimes like you're not permitted to include that as part of your sort of male identity.
Right.
And so I highly recommend that people look back at that interview.
Yeah.
But I think it's so interesting that it came up that folks within this group surfaced that for themselves. That there's parts of us that's really missing if we adhere to this very rigid definition of what masculinity looks like. And then the other thing that really is interesting to me is that you are working a lot with at least some men and boys, right? Which is not always common in domestic violence and sexual violence work. So tell me about that.
Well, we had a significant number of young men and boys involved in our work, and it was really powerful. And actually, the first young person that was involved in the Close to Home work in Boston was a young man, and he recruited his friends. He recruited through his social network, and that's how a lot of our work grew, was through word of mouth and through peers recruiting each other. And it was so important, right, to have young men in the mix. And it's still obviously important in the work that's happening in California. That's still the case. And so, so it was really powerful. But I wanted to just follow up on the evaluation question, which is that while in Boston, we did, it was all qualitative evaluation. We also know that domestic and sexual violence became part of the standing civic agenda, at the monthly meetings, so there were just ways that it became integrated into the community life that we could point to. In the work that's happening in California, and so just to bridge to that, because we haven't mentioned that yet, that back in 2000, so we did our work in Dorchester, although with it primarily only focused on Dorchester, but we're contacted pretty regularly in those early years by folks that were just curious about what we were up to. And so in around 2008 or 9, we were able to develop partnerships with both the Massachusetts and California's the departments of public health to share the approach with other communities. So we learned a lot about like what it means to actually try to share something that was developed in one particular context in other contexts. And how do we do that? What works, what doesn't work? And so the work in California has been going on now since then, for about 10 years. And the health department has...
It's ongoing, right?
Yeah. There have been 3 cycles of funding of the close to home approach in California. And so there is some more quantitative evaluation that's coming out of the sites in California. And I think that you're going to link to a report near this podcast, right? That will have some of that information. The data, there's some individual level data, but then also some information about community level impact. And then during this funding cycle, where there's going to be more evaluation that happens in an effort to sort of, again, demonstrate the efficacy of engaging community members. So more to come. Yeah.
Hey, that's super exciting because I do appreciate my quantitative peers. I do some of that myself sometimes. So I like when there's that kind of mixed method approach. I think it's really informative and valuable. And I also think there's a certain practical component, right? Where other folks want to say like, okay, I mean, this all sounds great, but what happens at the end?
Right.
What happens, folks?
Yeah. And I think this work's not easy to measure. It's just not. It's like, some of it is not easy to measure. So it's really exciting that folks are developing tools and processes to like speak to community level outcomes and some of the more medium term things that we're looking for that we feel confident will point to a reduction in violence. So.
Right.
Yeah.
So just to stay on evaluation for another hot second, because you know that is my love and my baby.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about when you started getting this first round of qualitative kind of feedback and discussion. Were there things that you learned from that made you feel like, oh, let's tweak this approach a little bit, or like, we hadn't thought about that? I'm just curious about like sort of beyond the learnings of like, oh, people really took it in. Was there anything that made you feel like, oh, maybe if we did this again, we might tweak that, something like that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I feel like that happened all the time, not just when we started to get evaluation information, that this was a constant process of tweaking. And so, I mean, that speaks to having the time and space to do reflection on what we're learning. And so we set up pretty robust reflection tools where people that were implementing activities, after every activity, had to do some reflection and journaling about that. And then we met together as a team a couple of times a month to talk about what we were learning and what was happening. After every activity, we would do a plus delta and say, okay, what would you do differently next time? And then, like do our best to actually next time we did an event, look at that information and try to incorporate what we could. I feel like we do those often and they go into a file drawer or Google Doc or whatever. And, but we did our best. I wouldn't say we did 100% of the time, but we did our best to try to like move our learnings forward. Just because that was the spirit in which we were. Because I think, especially in the beginning, really didn't feel like there was much of a map, right? I think that we were really drawing on principles of organizing, principles of community work, and we're seeing what is the form that emerges out of that for this. What are the methods that will animate those principles? And then I think a key learning that we've had through all of these years of implementation across multiple sites in 2 states and very different community settings is that in many ways that the principles are more important than the method. And that like if we could go out and do community mapping or community surveying, but if I don't believe that community members are the expert, and I don't hold in my heart that I'm going to meet people where they are, wherever that is, even if I don't agree with it, then it doesn't matter how good my survey tool is in a way, that right, that I could be the best surveyor, but if I'm not holding those principles as I approach the work, then it turns into something else. It could turn into something else entirely, something more extractive, something that isn't about community members leading the inquiry or driving the work. And so I feel like that's one of the biggest lessons that we found. And so for an organization to be able to implement this, what we've also learned is that it requires a lot of buy-in, a lot of commitment, like this very fierce commitment to community, a belief that community members are the experts and can lead and shape our solutions to this. So.
Right. So it's interesting. It makes sense in a way that like a values orientation is really key to this work, because so much of what you're describing is flexibility and adaptation to context, right?
Right.
How do you know what that context is if you don't have the kind of buy-in and voices of the stakeholders? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it takes time. It takes time to get that buy-in and build those relationships, even if you're from the community.
Thanks for listening. Tune in to part 3 to learn from fabulous flops on the road to community mobilizing and to hear Susan and Amy discuss next steps for close to home. Want to engage deeper with this podcast? Check out the Prevent Connect e-learning course based on this interview. A link is provided on this podcast page on our website.